My name is not important, but what happened on the third Saturday of September I will never forget. For 12 years, I signed every document my family put in front of me: partnership agreements, tax extensions, a deed that gave me equal ownership of the vineyard I helped plant when I was 22 years old. I never read the fine print. I trusted my father. I trusted my brother. And when my father signed the entire property over to him last spring, I was banned from the harvest I had worked every single year of my adult life. No warning, no conversation, just a letter. And then yesterday, the head sommelier pulled a folder from the basement archives. A folder with my signature on it from 12 years ago. A signature my father swore never existed. This is the story of a family vineyard in Sonoma County, 60 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon my great-grandfather planted in 1927. And it's the story of what happens when a father chooses a son over a daughter and a 12-year-old deed threatens to tear apart everything they built. Because that signature doesn't just prove I was a partner, it proves my father knowingly lied. So the question now isn't whether I have a legal claim. It's whether I'm willing to fight for it in a courtroom, knowing that fight will burn the last bridge I have left. You need to understand the vineyard before you understand the war. My great-grandfather Antonio came to Sonoma County from Sicily in 1923 with a leather suitcase and 3 vine cuttings wrapped in wet newspaper. He bought 60 acres of hillside that everyone said was too steep for grapes and too rocky for anything else. He planted Cabernet Sauvignon because it reminded him of home, and he built a stone cellar by hand, 1 rock at a time, over 7 summers. That vineyard is not just land. It is a living archive of every decision, every sacrifice, every harvest my family ever made. By the time I was born, the vineyard was producing fruit for premium Napa labels. My father John inherited it in 1988, the year before I was born. He grew up in that stone cellar and he ran it with the same quiet stubbornness his father had shown. My mother died when I was 9, ovarian cancer, and from then on the vineyard raised us. My brother Tom is 4 years older. He was the heir apparent from the moment he could walk. Tom learned to drive a tractor before he learned to ride a bike. He knew every block of vines by name: block 7, block 12, the old cab block. And my father beamed at him with a pride he never once showed me. I was different. I loved the chemistry. I loved the fermentation curves, the pH readings, the moment when a wine that tasted like bitter mud in August turned into something with depth and structure by November. I studied enology at UC Davis, the top program in the country. I came home every summer to work the harvest. I was the one who convinced my father to replant the old cab block with a new clone that would handle the warming climate better. He ignored me for 2 years, then watched a neighboring vineyard do exactly what I suggested and win a 94-point rating from Wine Spectator. He never acknowledged it was my idea. That was the pattern. Tom got the credit, I got the work. The partnership deed was signed in September of 2012. I remember the date because it was the day before harvest started and my father called me into the office. Tom was already there. My father slid a document across the desk, 3 pages, single-spaced. He said, "Sign this, it makes you and Tom equal partners. The vineyard stays in the family when I'm gone." I read it. I was 22, fresh out of UC Davis, and I believed him. I signed, Tom signed. My father signed as the witness and notary. That deed went into a file cabinet in the basement archive, and I never thought about it again. For 12 years, I assumed I was an equal owner. I made decisions, I signed contracts, I ordered supplies, I managed the tasting room staff, I handled the harvest logistics while Tom handled the sales and the marketing. We had a division of labor that worked until it didn't. The shift started quietly. In 2021, my father began having memory lapses. Short-term things, forgetting appointments, misplacing keys. We wrote it off as stress, but it got worse. By 2023, he was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia, and that was when Tom started meeting with the family attorney without telling me. I found out by accident, a billing statement left on the kitchen counter. 5 meetings in 3 months, all billed to the vineyard account. I asked Tom about it. He said it was estate planning, standard stuff, nothing to worry about. I believed him. I kept believing him until the day I received the certified letter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. That morning, I had walked the vineyard rows checking bud break. The weather had been warm and the early bud push looked strong. I was optimistic about the harvest. Then I opened the envelope. It was a notice of ownership transfer. The property, all 60 acres, all buildings, all equipment, had been transferred to Thomas John Ravelli, sole owner. The signature page showed my father's signature, dated 1 month earlier. There was no mention of me. No partnership, no deed. I called my father. He didn't answer. I drove to the house. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He looked at me and I could see the confusion in his eyes, the same confusion that came with the dementia. He said, "Karen, what's wrong?" I showed him the letter. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "I don't remember signing this." I believed him because I knew the disease was stealing pieces of his mind. But I also knew that Tom had been the one to schedule the appointment, drive him to the attorney's office, hand him the pen. The next week, I tried to access the vineyard bank accounts. They were locked. Tom had changed the passwords. I tried to enter the tasting room to check inventory. The locks had been changed. I stood in the parking lot staring at the building I had helped run for a decade, and I realized I had no legal standing. The partnership deed I had signed 12 years ago existed in one place, a file cabinet in the basement archive of the old stone cellar, a file cabinet that my brother now controlled. And then came the harvest ban. Tom sent me a text message, not even a phone call. Karen, I think it's best if you don't come to harvest this year. It would create confusion for the staff. I did not respond. I drove to the vineyard at dawn the next day, parked at the gate, and walked into the cellar. I found the head sommelier, Marco, who had worked for our family for 31 years. He was cleaning barrels, his hands wet with sulfite solution. I told him what happened. He did not say a word. He walked to the back of the cellar, pulled a key from his pocket, opened a steel filing cabinet that I had never seen before, and handed me a folder. Inside was the original partnership deed. My signature was on page 3, clearly dated and notarized. I held it in my hands for the first time in 12 years. Marco looked at me and said, I made a copy the day your father signed it. I knew your brother would try something one day. That deed is now in a safe deposit box at a bank in Santa Rosa. My brother does not know I have it. My father does not remember signing it. And I have a choice to make: walk away from everything I built or walk into a courtroom and destroy the last family I have left. I did not sleep that night. The deed sat on my kitchen counter under a salt lamp, and I kept reading the same line over and over. Karen Marie Ravelli and Thomas John Ravelli, equal partners in full ownership of Ravelli Vineyards and Estates, Sonoma County, California. Notarized, dated, legal. I had the only copy Marco saved, and I had no idea if Tom knew it existed. The next morning, I drove to Santa Rosa and put the deed in a safe deposit box at Wells Fargo. The teller asked if I needed anything else. I said, a good lawyer. She did not laugh. I called 3 firms that afternoon. The first one specialized in family law and said they did not handle property disputes. The second one said they only worked with corporations over $5 million in revenue. The third one, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who ran a small practice out of a converted Victorian house near the courthouse, said, come in tomorrow at 9. Bring everything you have. Patricia is 52, wears glasses on a chain, and has a voice that sounds like she has already won every case she will ever argue. I sat in her office surrounded by bookshelves stacked 2 deep. She read the deed in silence, then read it again. Then she looked at me and said, your father had dementia when he signed the transfer to your brother. He was diagnosed 1 month before the signing. Patricia set the deed down. That is the first problem. If he lacked capacity at the time of the transfer, the entire thing could be voided, but we would need medical records, a physician's affidavit, and proof that your brother knew about the diagnosis. I said Tom drove him to the appointment. She nodded. That is evidence of undue influence. The second problem is the original partnership deed. It grants you equal ownership, but if your brother destroyed the vineyard's copy, he will claim it never existed. Your copy is the only surviving original. I asked, is that enough? She said, it is a start, but your brother has already spent money and hired attorneys. He will argue that your father intended to disinherit you, that the partnership was never meant to be permanent, and that you abandoned the vineyard by not working there this harvest. I said, he banned me from the harvest. Patricia smiled. It was not a warm smile. Then we prove it. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia sent a letter to Tom's attorney demanding access to the vineyard's financial records from the past 5 years. She also filed a preliminary injunction to freeze any asset sales or ownership transfers until the dispute was resolved. Tom responded through his lawyer in 7 days. His response was 9 pages long. It accused me of attempting to exploit our father's dementia for financial gain. It claimed I had been estranged from the family for years. It said I had voluntarily left the vineyard in 2023 and had not participated in any operations since. I read it in Patricia's office and felt my stomach turn. Patricia said, he is laying groundwork for a character attack. He will try to paint you as the one who walked away. We need witnesses who can testify that you were actively involved until the day you were locked out. I said, Marco, the tasting room manager, the lead viticulturist. Patricia wrote their names down. Then she said, there is one more thing. I traced the property transfer filing. Your brother backdated the deed of transfer to December of 2022, 4 months before our father's dementia diagnosis. If that is true, then the transfer happened before the diagnosis and his capacity argument is weaker. I asked, did my father actually sign it in December? Patricia paused. The notary stamp is from April. The date on the document is December. That mismatch is a problem for your brother, but it also means we have to prove the document was altered. I left her office with a list of tasks: gather my father's medical records, find witnesses who could verify the timeline, locate anyone who was present when the transfer was signed, and the hardest one, talk to my father directly, even though he might not remember me. I drove to the house on a Sunday afternoon. My father was sitting on the back porch overlooking the vineyard. The late summer light made the rows look like they were glowing. He was sipping iced tea and staring at the hills. He did not turn when I walked up. I sat in the chair next to him. He looked at me and for a second I saw recognition. Then it flickered. He said, are you with the county? I said, no, Dad, it's Karen. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said, Karen. You look different. I said, I am different. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then I asked him, do you remember signing papers with Tom last spring? He frowned. Tom takes care of the papers. I just sign where he tells me. I said, do you remember signing a paper that gave the vineyard to Tom alone? He looked out at the vineyard. His eyes were wet. The vineyard is yours, both of you. That is how I set it up. I said, Dad, you changed it. He shook his head slowly. I don't remember that. I believed him. I also believed that Tom had made sure he would not remember. That same week, I went to see the lead viticulturist, a man named Carlos who had worked at Ravelli for 23 years. He was in the middle of harvest prep, cleaning the destemmer, and he did not stop working while we talked. He said, I saw Tom in the office late at night, 3 weeks before he locked you out. He was on the phone with someone talking about cleaning up the paperwork. I asked him about it the next day. He said it was nothing. I knew it was not nothing. I asked, would you testify to that? Carlos stopped working and turned to face me. I have a family. Tom can fire me. He already threatened to cut my hours. I said, if this goes to court, you could be subpoenaed. He looked down at his hands. Then I will tell the truth. I have watched this vineyard for 23 years. I have watched you work it. I know who belongs here. I collected 4 other witnesses over the next 10 days. The tasting room manager confirmed that Tom had instructed her to change the locks and not give me a key. The former bookkeeper, who had retired in 2022, said she remembered the original partnership filing and that it clearly listed both names. A neighbor who had known my father for 40 years said he recalled a conversation in early 2023 where my father mentioned that both his children would inherit equally. And Marco, the head sommelier, provided a written statement detailing how he had made a copy of the partnership deed the day it was signed because he saw something in Tom's eyes that he did not trust. Then came the pivot. Patricia called me on a Thursday evening. Her voice was different, not alarmed, but careful. She said, I found something in the financial records Tom handed over. He was required to disclose all accounts, but he tried to hide one. A Shell LLC opened in Nevada 6 months before the transfer. The LLC owns a separate warehouse and bottling facility near Napa. He has been moving inventory there under a different label. I said, he is siphoning product. Patricia said he is building a parallel business. If he wins the vineyard, he will have the land and the brand. If he loses, he will have the warehouse and the inventory. He has been planning this for at least a year. I sat down. So the transfer was not just about cutting me out, it was about covering his tracks. Patricia said, exactly, and that changes everything because now we can argue fraud, not just undue influence. We can argue that he used our father's declining capacity to execute a scheme that had been in motion long before the diagnosis. That night, I sat on my porch and looked at the stars. The harvest moon was rising over the hills. I thought about my father in the cellar with Antonio laying the first stones. I thought about my mother who never lived to see the vineyard reach its potential, and I thought about Tom, my brother, who I had once loved, who I had trusted, who I had defended to everyone who ever questioned his motives. I called Patricia the next morning. I said, file the lawsuit. I want everything. The partnership deed, the fraud, the undue influence, the backdated transfer. I want the truth in front of a judge. She said, are you sure there is no going back after this? I said, there was no going back the day he changed the locks. A lawsuit was filed in Sonoma County Superior Court on September 5th. Patricia named Tom and the vineyard as defendants. She also named the LLC in Nevada as a co-defendant. The local newspaper picked it up. A reporter named Diane Chen from the Press Democrat called me that afternoon. I did not answer. Patricia advised me not to comment publicly, but the story was already out. Sibling feud over Sonoma vineyard turns legal. That was the headline. Friends started texting. Distant cousins called. My aunt in Modesto left a voicemail that said, I always knew Tom was trouble. I did not feel triumphant. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff with no one behind me. 3 days later, Tom filed a countersuit. He accused me of stealing confidential business documents, the partnership deed. He accused me of trespassing on vineyard property after I had been banned. And he asked the court to issue a restraining order preventing me from coming within 500 feet of the vineyard or any of its employees. I read the filing in Patricia's office. She said, he is trying to silence your witnesses. If a restraining order is granted, you cannot contact Carlos or Marco without risking arrest. I said, can he do that? Patricia said, he can try. The hearing is in 2 weeks. We need to be ready. 2 weeks, the harvest was starting. The fruit was on the vines, and I could not step foot on the land my great-grandfather planted. I could not walk the rows I had walked every September for 12 years. I could not taste the grapes to decide when to pick. I was locked out of my own life, and my brother was in the tasting room pouring wine for visitors, pretending I had never existed. The hearing date arrived. I wore a navy blazer and stood beside Patricia while Tom sat 10 feet away with his attorney. The judge was a woman named Harriet Lowe, 63 years old, silver hair, reading glasses perched low on her nose. She listened to both sides without expression. Tom's attorney argued that I had stolen a legal document that belonged to the vineyard. Patricia argued that the deed was my personal property as an equal partner and that I had retrieved it from a location I had legal access to. The judge asked to see the original deed. Patricia handed it over. The judge studied the signature page, then looked at me. Ms. Ravelli, how long have you known about this document? I said, I signed it 12 years ago. I did not know a copy existed until my brother locked me out of the vineyard. She looked at Tom. Mr. Ravelli, when was the last time you saw this document? Tom said, I do not recall. The judge set the deed down. I am denying the restraining order. The document is clearly filed and notarized. Ms. Ravelli has a legitimate claim to ownership. If you want to pursue the trespassing claim, you will need to provide evidence that she entered the property after being notified she was not an owner. Given that she was an equal partner under this deed, that claim is tenuous at best. Tom's face went white. His attorney whispered something to him. The judge continued. I am also ordering both parties to preserve all financial records, communications, and documents related to the Vineyard's operations for the past 5 years. Failure to do so will result in sanctions. The trial date will be set for January 15th. I suggest both sides attempt mediation before then. We walked out of the courthouse into September sun. Patricia touched my elbow. That went better than expected. He did not expect you to have the original deed. I said he thought Marco would destroy it. Patricia said he underestimated Marco and he underestimated you. I took a breath. The trial was 4 months away. The harvest was happening without me. My father was fatting, and my brother had just learned that the fight would be harder than he thought. But the real escalation came the next day. I received a phone call from an unknown number. A voice I did not recognize said, "You need to drop the lawsuit for your own safety." I said, "Who is this?" The line went dead. I called Patricia. She said, "Document it, write down the time and the number, and do not go anywhere alone." I stood in my kitchen looking at the salt lamp, the empty counter where the deed had sat. The war had just begun. And I had no idea who else was on my brother's side. The anonymous phone call came again the next night. Same number, same voice. "You have until Friday to drop the case. After that, we cannot guarantee your safety." I asked, "Who is we?" The line went dead. I called the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office. They said they could not trace the number without a warrant, and they could not get a warrant without evidence of a credible threat. I said, "He just threatened me." The deputy said, "Ma'am, we need something more specific. A name, a location, a time. Otherwise, it is a phone call from a blocked number." I hung up and called Patricia. She said, "Do not delete the voicemail if he leaves one, and start carrying pepper spray." I did not tell her I already owned a shotgun my father gave me when I moved into my first apartment. It sat in my closet, unloaded, wrapped in a flannel shirt. That night, I loaded it and placed it under my bed. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark, listening to the wind move through the oaks, and I thought about how quickly my life had turned into something I did not recognize. The next morning, Patricia called with news. She had subpoenaed the Nevada LLC's bank records. A judge signed the order at 8 a.m. By noon, she had a stack of transactions going back 18 months. I drove to her office. She spread the documents across her conference table, and I saw what my brother had been doing. He moved $240,000 from the Vineyard operating account into the Nevada LLC between January and June of this year. He listed the transfers as consulting fees to a company called Napa Valley Distribution Group. That company does not exist. I said, "He is stealing from the Vineyard." Patricia said, "He is stealing from you. Half of that money is yours under the partnership deed, and he used the Vineyard's line of credit to borrow another $100,000, which he also moved to the LLC." I said, "What did he spend it on?" Patricia flipped to another page. Equipment. A new bottling line, stainless steel tanks, a refrigerated truck. He is building a complete production facility. If he wins the Vineyard, he will have the brand and the infrastructure. If he loses, he has a separate business ready to go. I said, "That is evidence of fraud." Patricia nodded. "It is, but he will argue that the money was spent on legitimate Vineyard expenses. We need to prove that the LLC is not related to the Vineyard's operations." I said, "How do we do that?" Patricia said, "We need someone inside his operation to confirm that the equipment was delivered to the Nevada facility, not to the Vineyard." I knew exactly who to ask. Marco, the head sommelier, had worked for Tom for the past 3 months, and he had access to delivery logs. I called him from Patricia's office. He answered on the first ring. "I was about to call you. Tom let 3 people go this morning. Carlos, the viticulturist, the tasting room manager, and the assistant winemaker. He said it was restructuring." I said, "He is clearing out anyone who might testify against him." Marco said, "I know. And I think I am next. He has been watching me since the deed was found. I found a tracking device on my truck last week." I said, "Marco, I need to ask you something. Did you see any equipment deliveries that did not belong at the Vineyard?" He paused. "Yes, 3 weeks ago a truck arrived with a new bottling line. It was addressed to the Vineyard, but Tom directed the driver to a warehouse in American Canyon. I asked him about it. He said it was backup equipment." I did not believe him. I said, "Would you testify to that in court?" Marco was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have worked for your family for 31 years. I watched you grow up. I watched your father build this place. I will testify." That night I drove past the Vineyard. The lights were on in the tasting room. I could see figures moving inside. I parked down the road and watched. A truck with Nevada plates was backed up to the cellar loading dock. 2 men were loading pallets of wine. I took photos with my phone. I sent them to Patricia with a message. "He is moving inventory tonight." She replied, "Do not approach. I will file an emergency order to freeze the inventory. Stay safe." I watched for another hour. The truck left. I followed it at a distance, keeping 3 cars back. It took the 101 south, then turned toward American Canyon. I lost it on a dark industrial road, but I knew where it was going. The emergency order was filed the next morning. Patricia argued that Tom was liquidating assets in anticipation of a negative judgment. The judge agreed to an immediate freeze on all inventory transfers until a hearing could be held. Tom's attorney called Patricia within an hour. He was furious. Patricia told me later he accused us of acting in bad faith. I told him to read the order. I said, "What happens now?" Patricia said, "We have a deposition scheduled for next week. Tom will have to testify under oath about the Nevada LLC and the inventory moves. That is where we break him." The deposition was held in Patricia's office. Tom arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett Vance who wore suits that cost more than my car. Tom looked thinner than I remembered, and there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. I sat across the table from him. Patricia began, "Mr. Ravelli, do you acknowledge the existence of Napa Valley Distribution Group?" Tom said, "I am not familiar with that entity." Patricia slid a bank statement across the table. "This shows a transfer of $80,000 from the Vineyard account to that entity on March 15th of this year. Do you recognize this transaction?" Tom stared at the paper. His attorney leaned in and whispered something. Tom said, "I do not recall that specific transfer." Patricia said, "Let me help you. The transfer was signed by you. The signature matches the one on file with the bank." Tom's face reddened. "I sign a lot of documents." Patricia said, "You signed a document transferring funds to a company that does not have a registered address, a phone number, or a website. Can you explain what services this company provided to the Vineyard?" Tom looked at his attorney. Vance said, "My client will not speculate on business transactions without reviewing the documents further." Patricia said, "Your client is under oath." Tom said, "I am not answering that question." The deposition went on for 4 hours. Patricia extracted piece after piece. Tom admitted to changing the locks. He admitted to firing the 3 employees. He admitted to moving inventory without documentation. But every time she pressed on the LLC, he refused to answer. Patricia finally looked at the court reporter. "Please note that Mr. Ravelli has refused to answer questions regarding the Nevada entity on 17 separate occasions." Then she turned to Tom. "You do understand that a judge will see that transcript, correct? And they will draw an adverse inference." Tom did not respond. He just stared at the table. After the deposition, I walked to my car and found a note under my windshield wiper. It was handwritten in block letters. "Drop the case, last warning." I called the sheriff again. This time I had a physical piece of evidence. A deputy came, took the note, put it in an evidence bag, and said they would check for fingerprints. He also said, "You should consider staying somewhere else for a few days." I said, "I am not leaving my home." The deputy shrugged. "Your call." That night I stayed at my house. I checked every lock twice. I kept the shotgun by the bed. I did not sleep. At 2 in the morning, I heard a noise outside. I went to the window. A truck was idling at the end of my driveway. I could not see the plates. I called 911. The dispatcher said a unit would be dispatched. I watched the truck sit there for 10 minutes, then it drove away. The deputy arrived 15 minutes later. He walked the perimeter, found nothing, and told me to call if I saw the truck again. I sat on the floor in the hallway, back against the wall, and I did not move until sunrise. The next week, Patricia called with news that changed everything. She said, "I found something in the financial records that your brother overlooked, a payment to a private investigator, $13,000 paid over 6 months. I said, "He was investigating me." Patricia said, "He was, and I found reports in the discovery documents, photographs of you, your car, your house. He had you followed." I felt cold. "For how long?" Patricia said, "At least 8 months. He started before he changed the locks. He was building a case against you before you even knew there was a fight." That was the moment I understood the full scope of what my brother had done. The partnership deed, the transfer, the inventory theft, the threats, the investigator. It was not a reaction to my lawsuit. The lawsuit just made him accelerate a plan he had been running for years. He had been preparing to erase me from the Vineyard long before I knew there was a war. I drove to the Vineyard the next morning, not to enter, just to stand at the gate and look at the sign. Ravelli Vineyards S 1927, my great-grandfather's name, my father's name, my name. Once I was standing there when a car pulled up behind me. It was Tom. He got out. We stood 10 feet apart on the gravel. He said, "You are not supposed to be here." I said, "I am standing on a public road. I can stand here as long as I want." He looked at me. "You have no idea what you are doing. This lawsuit is going to destroy everything Dad built." I said, "You destroyed it the day you changed the locks." He shook his head. "You always played the victim. Even when we were kids, it was always about you." I said, "I have a deed that says we are equal partners. I have evidence that you stole from the Vineyard. I have 14 witnesses who will testify that you locked me out. And I have a deposition transcript where you refused to answer 17 questions. So tell me, Tom, how am I the victim now?" He did not answer. He got back in his car and drove up the hill. On December 1st, Patricia called with the trial update. The judge had set a final pretrial conference for January 5th. Discovery was closed. All evidence had to be submitted by December 15th. We submitted everything: the partnership deed, the bank records, the Nevada LLC filings, the deposition transcript, the witness statements, the photographs of the inventory transfer, the note from my windshield, the private investigator reports. Patricia said, "We have a strong case." But trials are unpredictable. A jury might sympathize with your brother. He is good at playing the aggrieved son. We need something that makes the jury see him for what he is. I spent the next 2 weeks thinking about what that something was. And then on December 20th, my father's caretaker called me. She said, "Your father has been asking for you. He is having a clear day. I think you should come." I drove to the house. My father was sitting in the living room. The Christmas lights were on. He was wearing a sweater I had never seen before. He looked at me and said, "Karen, I remember." I sat beside him. He said, "I remember signing the papers." I remember Tom telling me it was a routine update. I remember he did not show me the page where my name was removed. He started to cry. "I am sorry, I did not know what I was doing." I held his hand. I said, "I know, Dad, I know." He said, "I want to testify. I want to tell the judge what Tom did." I said, "Dad, the dementia." He said, I have days where I remember, write it down today, record it today, so when I forget again, you have it. That afternoon, with his caretaker as a witness, I recorded my father's statement on my phone. He described in precise detail the day Tom drove him to the attorney's office. He described being told it was a standard estate update. He described signing without reading. He did not remember the exact date on the document, but he remembered the weather. It was raining, April rain, the kind that comes sideways. I said, are you sure we need to do this today? Tom said it has to be done before the harvest. April, the notary stamp was April, but the document said December. The mismatch was his memory and it matched the evidence. I had the recording, I had his voice, I had his permission. Patricia listened to it the next day. She said, this changes the narrative completely. A vulnerable elderly father manipulated by a son who exploited his declining mind. A jury will not forgive that, I said, but he might not remember giving the statement on the day of the trial. Patricia said, that is why we have the recording, and we will have his caretaker testify to his lucid intervals. January 5th arrived. The pretrial conference was brief. The judge confirmed the trial date, January 15th. Both sides submitted their witness lists. Tom's list included 3 expert witnesses, a forensic accountant, a dementia specialist, and a handwriting analyst. He was going to challenge the partnership deed's authenticity and argue that our father lacked capacity when he signed the original partnership, not just the transfer. Patricia looked at the list and said, he's going to try to invalidate the deed itself. If he can prove your father was not competent when he signed it 12 years ago, the deed is void and you have no claim. I said, my father was fine 12 years ago. Patricia said, I know, but experts can testify about early onset dementia that went undiagnosed. They can make a plausible argument even without medical records. We need to preempt that. On January 10th, 5 days before trial, I received a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, me standing at the Vineyard gate. The photo had been taken 3 days earlier. On the back, someone had written in red ink, you were warned. I called Patricia. She said, I am filing a motion for a protective order and I am requesting that the judge allow you to testify remotely. This is witness intimidation. The judge granted the protective order. She also allowed me to appear via video from Patricia's office with a deputy present. January 15th, trial day, I wore a dark blazer, no jewelry. I sat in Patricia's conference room with a laptop, a deputy standing by the door. The courtroom was 2 blocks away. I could see the courthouse dome through the window. Patricia looked at me through the screen. You ready? I said, I have been ready for 12 years. She said, then let's go remind them who built that vineyard. The judge called the court to order. The clerk read the case number. And my brother and I began the final chapter of a war that should never have been fought. The courtroom was full. I could see it through the video feed, the gallery packed with Vineyard employees, neighbors, reporters. Tom sat at the defendant's table with Garrett Vance. My father was not there. His caretaker said he was having a bad day and could not recall where he was, but we had the recording. Patricia opened for the plaintiff. She stood before the jury, a small woman in a blue suit, and she spoke without notes. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a promise. A promise made 12 years ago when a father sat down with his 2 children, his son and his daughter, and told them they would share the vineyard equally. That promise was written, signed, and notarized. And then 4 years ago, that promise was erased. Not by the father, who by then could not remember his own address, but by the son who saw an opportunity and took it. You will hear from witnesses who watched it happen. You will see bank records that prove the son was planning this long before he told his sister she was no longer welcome. And you will hear the voice of the father himself, recorded on a day when his mind was clear, telling you the truth about what his son did. Tom's attorney gave his opening next. He stood and walked toward the jury box, hands in his pockets. This is a sad case, a family dispute that should have been resolved privately. My client, Thomas Ravelli, has run this vineyard for the past decade. He has managed the staff, the finances, the harvests. His sister, Karen, chose a different path. She moved away, she pursued other interests, and now, years later, she has returned with a document she claims proves she was an equal partner. We will show you that document was signed during a period when Mr. Ravelli's father was already showing signs of cognitive decline. We will show you that the signature may not even be his. And we will ask you to consider whether a woman who did not step foot on the property for years has any right to claim half of what her brother built. Patricia called her first witness. Marco walked to the stand in his sommelier uniform. He looked at me once through the camera, then faced the jury. Patricia asked, how long have you worked at Ravelli Vineyards? Marco said, 31 years. I started when I was 19. Patricia said, did you witness the signing of a partnership deed in September of 2012? Marco said, I did. I was in the cellar office when Mr. Ravelli brought in the document. He asked me to witness. I signed as a witness. Patricia held up the deed. Is this the document you witnessed? Marco examined it. Yes, that is my signature on the second page. Under cross-examination, Vance tried to shake him. Were you present for the entire meeting? Marco said, no, I signed and left. Vance said, so you do not know if Mr. Ravelli understood what he was signing? Marco said, he told me it was a partnership agreement between his children. He seemed clear to me. Vance pressed, you are not a medical professional. You cannot assess cognitive capacity. Marco said, I know a man who knows what he is doing when I see one. The next witness was Carlos. He testified about the late-night phone calls, the equipment deliveries, the mood in the vineyard after I was locked out. He said, "It felt wrong. Everyone knew it was wrong." Vance cross-examined. "Did you ever hear Mr. Ravelli say he intended to disinherit his daughter?" Carlos said, "No, he always said both kids would get the vineyard." Vance said, "Until he changed his mind." Carlos said, "He did not change his mind, someone changed it for him." Then came the forensic accountant Patricia had hired. She walked the jury through the bank records, the Nevada LLC, the payments, the inventory moves. She said the defendant moved over $300,000 from the Vineyard operating account to an entity that has no physical presence, no employees, and no business license. This is not a legitimate business expense. This is a systematic effort to divert assets. Vance objected. The judge overruled. The jury watched the accountant's presentation in silence. The most difficult witness was our father. He could not testify in person. His caretaker testified about his condition, his lucid intervals, his decline. Then Patricia played the recording. My father's voice filled the courtroom. He said, "Tom told me it was a routine update. He said it was just paperwork. He did not show me the page where my daughter was removed. I did not know. I did not know until Karen told me. I am sorry, Karen. I am so sorry." Several jurors wiped their eyes. The gallery was silent. Tom testified in his own defense. Vance guided him through a prepared narrative. He said he had always managed the vineyard, that I had lost interest, that he had consulted with our father every step of the way. My father wanted me to run the vineyard. He told me that many times. Patricia cross-examined. "Your father told you he wanted you to run the vineyard alone?" Tom said, "Yes." Patricia said, "Did he ever put that in writing?" Tom said, "I do not know." Patricia said, "Did you ever ask him to?" Tom said, "No." Patricia held up the bank records. "You testified that you moved $300,000 to a company called Napa Valley Distribution Group. Can you describe what services that company provided?" Tom said, "I do not recall." Patricia said, "You do not recall what you received for $300,000? Tom said, "It was a consulting arrangement." Patricia said, "Who did you consult with?" Tom said, "I do not remember his name." Patricia said, "You paid $300,000 to a consultant whose name you do not remember?" Tom said, "It was a while ago." Patricia turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that my learned friend is not suffering from a failure of memory. He is suffering from a failure of honesty." Vance objected. The judge sustained. But the damage was done. I saw the jurors exchange glances. Closing arguments took place on the fourth day. Patricia stood before the jury. "This case is about a deed that proves Karen Ravelli is an equal owner of Ravelli Vineyards. That deed was signed by her father. It was witnessed by an employee who has worked there for 31 years. It was notarized, and it was hidden by a brother who knew that if the deed came to light, his plan would fail. You have heard the evidence. You have seen the bank records. You have heard the voice of a dying man. I ask you to uphold the promise that was made 12 years ago." Vance's closing was shorter. "My client has run this vineyard for years. He has sacrificed his personal life for it. His sister moved away. She did not do the work. She does not deserve half of what he built. The deed is old. Memories are faulty. The only person who could have clarified this is no longer competent to do so. Do not let an old piece of paper undo years of hard work." The judge instructed the jury. They filed out at 3 in the afternoon. I sat in Patricia's conference room, staring at the video feed of the empty courtroom. The deputy stood by the door. Patricia said, "It will take a few hours at least." I said, "What if they believe him?" Patricia said, "Then we appeal, but I do not think they will." I said, "Why?" Patricia said, "Because juries can smell a liar." 3 hours and 47 minutes later, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. I watched the courtroom fill again. My brother walked in. He looked pale. His attorney whispered something in his ear. The judge said, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. A woman in her 50s with gray hair and reading glasses. She held a piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk read the verdict. "On the claim of breach of partnership agreement, we find for the plaintiff, Karen Ravelli. On the claim of fraud, we find for the plaintiff, Karen Ravelli. On the counterclaim of theft of documents and trespassing, we find for the defendant, Thomas Ravelli, on the trespassing claim only. On the counterclaim of defamation, we find for the plaintiff, Karen Ravelli." The judge thanked the jury. I heard the words, but they did not fully register. Patricia looked at the camera and said, "You won." I said, "I won." The deputy smiled. The feed showed Tom standing at the defendant's table. His face was blank. His attorney was packing his briefcase. Tom did not look at the camera. He did not look at me. He just walked out of the courtroom. The judge ordered an accounting of all assets and a return of the property to the partnership. She appointed a receiver to oversee the transition. She also ordered Tom to pay restitution for the diverted funds. The full amount was to be determined at a later hearing, and she gave me the right to return to the vineyard immediately. I drove there that evening. The gates were open, the harvest was long over, and the vines were bare. The lights were on in the tasting room. Marco was waiting at the door. He said, "Welcome home." I walked through the cellar. The barrels were stacked. The tanks were clean. The stone walls my great-grandfather built were still standing. I walked up to the house. My father's caretaker met me at the door. She said, "He knows. He is in his room. He wants to see you." I went to his room. He was sitting by the window, looking out at the dark vineyard. He turned when I entered. He said, "Karen." He said it like he had been waiting to say it for years. I sat beside him. He said, "Did we win?" I said, "We won, Dad." He nodded. "Good, that vineyard belongs to you. It always did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found this in the cellar. It was in a box your great-grandfather left. I think you should have it." I unfolded it. It was a letter handwritten in Italian, dated 1953. My great-grandfather had written it to his son, my grandfather. In it, he said, "The vineyard is not a possession. It is a trust. Pass it to the one who loves it, not the one who demands it." I read it twice. I looked at my father. His eyes were closed. He was breathing slowly. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I walked outside. The night air was cold. The stars were out. The vineyard stretched below me, row after row, dormant but alive. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Congratulations, you earned it." I did not respond. I did not need to. I had the vineyard. I had the deed. I had the truth. And I had the letter that told me everything I needed to know about who I was and where I came from. The war was over. The harvest would come again, and I would be there. I am standing in the vineyard the morning after the verdict. The fog is burning off the hills, and the first light is hitting the old cab block. I can see Marco walking the rows, checking the canes, already thinking about next year's crop. The vineyard does not stop. It does not care about lawsuits or verdicts or the pain that got us here. It just keeps growing, keeps demanding attention, keeps asking for the work. That is the thing about a family business. Everyone thinks it is about the money. It is not. It is about the choice of who gets to carry the weight. My brother wanted the vineyard as a prize. I want it as a responsibility. There is a difference, and that difference decided everything. I have not spoken to Tom since the courtroom. His attorney called yesterday. He is exploring an appeal. I told Patricia to let him try. The evidence is on our side, and the jury already spoke. But an appeal means more years, more money, more distance between us. I do not know if we will ever be brother and sister again. Maybe that door is closed forever. Maybe it should be. What I do know is this: the letter my great-grandfather wrote in 1953 is framed now, hanging in the tasting room. It says, "Pass it to the one who loves it, not the one who demands it." I read it every morning. It reminds me that ownership is not about signatures or bank accounts. It is about what you are willing to sacrifice for the land. My father sacrificed his health. Marco sacrificed 31 years of loyalty. Carlos sacrificed his job when he told the truth. I sacrificed the illusion of a family that never really existed. If this story made you think about your own family, your own boundaries, or a fight you're not sure you can win, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment, tell me what you would have done. And if you want to follow what happens next, subscribe, because the harvest is only the beginning. The real work is what comes after, building something new on ground that was almost lost. I am Karen Ravelli, and this vineyard is still standing. I intend to keep it that way.